Thank you, Zoom. Why is the light off in here?
What?
Should we turn it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, do it.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, much better.
It's so dark in here.
Yeah, I think so.
She can hear us?
Mm-hmm.
We can hear her?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Can she see us? Hey,
She
Bruna.
can't see us, but
Don't know if you can see me, but hi. Give a thumbs
she's
up.
waving.
Great. Yep. All right.
Ooh.
Okay, so 5 minutes.
Hmm. I'll give it a couple of minutes. It's a Zoom. So she's on light? Yeah, I think she's on the No, she can't see us.
Can she see it?
No.
Oh.
I think all she can see is my face, maybe.
Yeah.
No. Well, if I did, I would have had to have put it somewhere and I don't have it. Hmm. Oh, maybe I did put it. I might have put it over here. Okay. So here we go.
Oh.
Here. And I'm gonna bring this down to registration, I think so.
Yeah, no worries. Ooh. I'm gonna give it 2 minutes. Mm. Hang on. No, I can introduce myself. Sorry. Take some pics. I will. We usually close the door or leave it open.
I think we should close it once.
Okay. Yeah.
Once you're ready.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Hi, Robin. Okay, hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, good, lots of notes. That's what I like. Thank you for coming to our talk today. This is going to be about DIY UX research, setting your digital projects up for success. Now, because it is the year 2025, we are actually beaming my co-presenter in from Charlotte, North Carolina. She was meant to be here today, but again, with the power of the internet, we're going to make it work. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Celia. I'm a digital strategist at Evolving Web, one half of the strategy team. I've spent 7 years in strategy and insights roles across various different sectors like government, nonprofit, and gaming most recently. I really love uncovering user insights to help drive focus and development for the greatest business impact.
Excellent. Yeah. And thanks everybody for being flexible that I'm joining virtually. But I'm Bruna Siqueira-Davis. I'm a senior digital strategist here at Evolving Web. My passion for research started when I was getting my bachelor's degree, and I studied sociology and biology and did some academic research there. But I've spent the last 7 years and change working on digital products. And I think today my passion really with research is about trying to leverage both quantitative and qualitative research and data to make better connections between real people and digital products. So yeah, glad to be here.
Oh, so what are you going to learn today in this session? Well, this is what we hope you're going to learn. Because we're going to cover the fundamentals. We're going to help you understand what UX research is and what it isn't, and help you hopefully connect its value and impact to some of your work. We're going to tell you a few A to Z sort of how-tos, so you can hopefully learn how to structure a research project for yourselves and choose a methodology and adapt that to your questions, goals, and constraints. As well as talking a little bit more about research for impact, understand how you're going to actually create UX research that creates a real business impact. Cool, so let's get into it. User research fundamentals. I wanted to start with some definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page about these terms: UX, user experience, and UX or user research, which I'm going to use interchangeably throughout today. So, what is user experience? Anyway, at its broadest definition, it's how we interact with or experience a product, system, or a service. Pretty much everything we interact with in this world has user experience of some form or another. In 2025, the term UX often applies specifically to digital products, which is the main context that we'll be speaking about it today. So, UX research is the work we do to understand the users and the process of understanding the impact of our design on them, on the audience. Who are they? What do they need? How are they behaving? How does our design meet or not meet their needs and context? It can be quite common to hear people speak about good UX like it's a blanket term, I find. In the same way, we hear sometimes people speak about applying AI like it's a commonplace best practice. But just in the same way that there's many individual UX paradigms that have become quite commonplace and broadly understood. For example, having a close button in the corner of your browser. But when the rubber hits the road and your product meets real users, things can get a bit more messy and unexpected. If we want to design a product that actually delivers a good UX, and we see good as relative, because we really need to understand our specific users or customers, their unique feelings, expectations, context, and perceptions. This is really the why of UX research. For example, let's imagine you're designing an e-commerce platform, and you know good UX in 2025 tends towards, I would say, clean and minimal UI. But let's say when your design hits the market, you find a huge segment of your customers are dropping off and not engaging, because perhaps they're from an area of the world that prefers a more information-dense UI, which is a real thing I learned in my last role gaming. Eastern audiences can tend towards wanting a far more dense UI. So that's just one example of how good UX can be relative.
funding and fire department. Market, timeout market. Please disregard any audible or visual signals that you may hear or see as well as the test. Thank you for your cooperation.
What is happening?
So what just happened was this was an example of a bad user experience. Today we actually put that in on purpose. No, we didn't. Bruna, there was some kind of test alarm warning. That's what that was. That's what you just heard. Hopefully there may or may not be any more. We'll see. We'll roll with it. Let's go. I'm just going to set an example of bad user experience for us. So let's talk a little bit more about what UX isn't, because some of the bigger mistakes we see happen when people bring the wrong expectations to the table about UX. So on the one hand, UX is not necessarily limited to a single interaction, product, or device. User experience is a lot more holistic. It's going to encompass perceptions, emotions, as well as interactions. As well as it's not, or it shouldn't be driven by technology. It should more be focused on people. Again, in that example from earlier, we have these paradigms that have become sort of commonplace best practice. That's not to say we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. Those are still very relevant. But UX as a practice, it's going to be a lot more people first, understanding your user first. It's also not a checklist to tick off, hopefully. It should be a process. It's ongoing, it's iterative. You are trying to get more input so you can sort of iterate your way forwards. And then it's also not the same as usability, visual design, or UI design. These are all sort of part of it. They can sit inside like this little diagram here. VD stands for visual design there. So they're all sort of parts of this, but it's not the same, because UI and visual design, that's more about how it looks, and UX is more around the function. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Cool. And I'm going to pass it to Bruna to talk about how it differs from academic research.
Yeah, thanks, Celia. So UX research is like research, but different. And I think the biggest thing that sometimes we run into with clients is, they may have a background in academic research. And so sometimes it's hard to understand the nuances and the differences of UX research. Because they're not exactly the same. So UX research is grounded in, right, a lot of psychology and human-computer interaction principles, but it's not inherently academic like those principles or like those disciplines. And essentially, right, whereas academic research is really about rigor or novelty, often long timelines, peer-reviewed, UX research is really about relevance and speed and actionability. And I think essentially, the takeaway is when you're doing this type of research, you're not writing a dissertation. You're doing this because you're trying to help your team make better bets. So I think, the thing to really remember is the goal of UX research is to put you in front of real people to try to understand how you can design or improve an experience with the actual insight. And we'll talk about the different types, right, that you can get from folks, but of the people who would actually be expected to use that technology. So yeah. And I guess that, we get this question as often as a follow-up to that point of, okay, but if it's not peer reviewed and, it's not as rigorous and it doesn't take you forever, does that mean it's pseudo research? And the answer is no. Even though academic research and UX research are different, UX research is still using well-established and real methods, right? So things that you may see in academic research, like interviews or looking at data analytics, right? Or surveys. And those are tried and true methods. And it does follow the general principles of the scientific method, right? So where you have a hypothesis you're testing, then the actual testing, right? And you want to try to make sure that those things are ones you can replicate. The difference is that it typically moves faster. And again, the goal is really to deliver real impact quickly, but still grounded in these behavioral science principles. So you're not just doing guesswork. So you see the little picture of snake oil. I've had somebody say that to me before, that UX research. It was like I was trying to sell them snake oil, and that's not the case. So I think that's a good foundation for us to start on. And we wanted you, so this is an interactive session. We're going to try to keep you engaged with some little questions throughout, but we have this question here. What's stopping you from doing user research today? And what we often hear from clients is either no time, no budget, maybe they don't have access to their target users, or they feel like there's a gap within their organization in the amount of experience or knowledge that their teams have to run these types of activities. So raise your hands if you feel like that sounds familiar or if it might be the case for you and your organization.
Time, budget, access, experience. Just for Bruna, who can't actually see us, there's a bunch of people raising their hands. Good.
Okay.
50%.
Perfect. Yeah. So I think, that's something we hear a lot. And hopefully we can give you the tools today to push through some of those barriers and be able to implement this in your organization.
Cool. Thank you, Bruna. So we'll talk a little bit about what we see as the main benefits of user research. So on one hand, or one arm, it can be sort of described as generally you're going to save in the long run a lot of time, money, and effort. And this is when your UX research is we don't want to say done right, but done well, meaning fit to purpose. When you're doing it well, it will save you time, money, and effort. It is an upfront investment, so you will need to justify it, but we just want to share some things about what the price of not doing it is that we've seen with some of our clients, what happens when you don't do it. So it can result in, I don't know if you've ever seen situations in your work or around you where someone's built a really expensive new feature, they've sunk a lot of money into it, and it ends up producing zero business impact because you didn't get it right about the problem you're solving for that user. You might have to be in a situation where you have to rebuild all over again because you only found out it didn't meet those user needs after it was finished, or a confusing product that people quickly abandon or they don't ever attempt to use. In our view, it's always going to be more expensive to get it really wrong than to spend a little bit of time on fit-to-purpose user research. So I wanted to talk about an example from the industry that this is sort of a symptom of this, perhaps. So the Tesla touchscreens in the car. If you've ever been in a Tesla, you know they replace what used to be lots of little buttons and switches with this big glossy touchscreen. Very futuristic, very impressive, like the idea. Many other car manufacturers followed suit. But what they're finding now is, since the design has been on the market for a few years, people are finding it adds friction, difficulty for simple core functions, not to mention actual safety risks. There was an analysis published in 2020 by an institute called the Transport Research Lab in the UK. They actually found that these car touchscreens impair drivers' reaction times more than being over the legal alcohol limit. After all of this, now, after all that, some manufacturers are thankfully starting to bring back the physical buttons again after all of that. So we could have saved ourselves a lot of time and possibly disasters if they'd done a little bit of research up front. Now, I also wanted to say more that it's not just about avoiding disaster, and it's not just divorced from profit. In fact, done right, it's going to help you uncover hidden opportunities that can lead to greater return on investment than a bigger or more difficult change. Dale's great Geo keynote talk this morning also underlined how important it is to know your customers and their problems, and how doing user research is key to this. He talked about observing that lady about how she found daycares. And so it's really about it's whoever gets closest to the customer wins. This will help you get close to the customer. So yeah, we wanted to share this positive story about a piece of user research that was clear, actionable, it was fit for purpose, it uncovered this tiny change for an outside impact. This is from Jared Spool. He's a UX usability expert, researcher, and author. Here's a story about an e-commerce company he worked for. customers were not completing their purchase, but nobody on the team knew exactly why. So they did some usability testing on that flow. They discovered a key insight. Customers were resisting registering to make an account at the very end. They just wanted to, in this case, make a purchase and leave the website. So they changed that register button to continue, and they made it optional to create an account. Changed the process a little bit. The simple change created a 45% increase in sales. They added an extra $50 million in the first month after that change, and an extra $300 million in the first year for changing text on a button. Incredible. So my point here is, even if you only have a small budget or a limited amount of time, UX research can be even more crucial for you to enable you to be really laser focused on what changes you're prioritizing for actual business impact. So now let's talk about the types of UX research. We sort of look at it at Evolving Web with sort of three buckets: exploration, assessment, and comparison. Exploration is often done early on before a solution exists. So this is when you're asking, what do users actually need or experience? How might we fulfill their unmet needs? And the assessment is, this is going to be when you're evaluating a current or proposed new product, feature, or process. And then for the comparison section, you're asking which option works better and for which users. So some more ways to think about it. Another way we like to think about it. We love frameworks, in case you couldn't tell. So yeah, there's on the other side, attitudinal versus behavioral. So there's what people say, that's attitudinal, what they actually do. Often you need to collect both types of information depending on the decision you're needing to help make, as well as qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative is more around themes, patterns, nuance, delving into the why. Quantitative is more about figuring out the scale of things. How many, how much, numbers and metrics.
Yeah, and when we look at this kind of these like quarters, right, of this graphic separately, we can map actually some of the popular methods that are used in our field to see where they kind of fall, right? So I won't go into all of these, but whereas something like usability testing, right, where you're either putting a live product or maybe you're testing a prototype in front of a user, that is, you're trying to get some behavioral data from them, but at the same time, you're hearing a little bit of their kind of more attitudinal, right? Like their thought process and things like that. And that falls more in that qualitative area. There are other things, right? Like surveys that are really quantitative and attitudinal, right? You're not seeing somebody doing something in context, but you're asking them questions where they share their attitude that you can quantify. Surveys can have a bit of some qualitative questions as well, but I think what we're going to talk about today are surveys at scale, and that's a bit different. Whereas, right, when you look at something like behavioral analytics, which could be your Google Analytics, or if you're doing heat mapping, things like that, that's really something that's in that kind of top quarter, right, where it's really something that's quantitative and behavioral. So we'll talk about some of these methods throughout the presentation today, and we just wanted to put some of these names out there so that they look familiar.
Cool. So now let's get into the A to Z of how we run user research processes at Evolving Web. So we've got 4 phases we like to go through: plan and design, crew, conducting the research, and then turning insights into impact. So now I'm going to delve into phase 1, plan and design. We're going to spend the longest here because it is arguably the most important. So thing 1 that you need to do, you have to define the why before the how. It can be really tempting to jump straight in and choose a method, but it's best to first zoom out and ask, what gap in knowledge are we addressing? So identifying that knowledge gap, it's what do we not actually know about users' goals, pain points, mindsets, or behaviors. Sometimes with clients, I like to couch them as assumptions. So you might think that you know, but you might want to go and find out more, or a hypothesis, which we'll talk about more. shortly. So you're also going to want to, again, set a clear objective about why do we need more information? What decision are we going to need to make once we get this information? So that might be about confirming or clarifying a suspected issue, validating an idea or concept, evaluating an existing solution, or more broadly, discovering goals, mindsets, or behaviors. It can be good to replace vague goals like improve usability with ones that are more targeted, like identify why and where users drop off during account setup. Doing this will sharpen your focus and it'll help you choose the right method to answer that question. Also sets you up for success at the end of things when you're synthesizing findings. So again, defining the practical value of the research and the priority in some senses as well. So it's which decision gets easier once we've collected more data, and conversely, what are the risks if we get this wrong, if we keep guessing. Cool. And then we're also going to want to create a set of hypotheses to explore. So hypotheses they are good because they make your research testable. They can confirm, refine, or challenge your thinking. They'll also help you reduce bias by surfacing your assumptions early. They're not always explicit, but I find it's good to do this because you can formally and systematically document the most important assumptions you're making about why something is happening or why the change you're proposing to make could work. If your research is purely exploratory, they may not be needed, but can still sometimes be useful. A hypothesis can look like this. So this format here is one we use sometimes. It's we believe user group does things needs X because Y. We believe first-time visitors leave the homepage quickly because they don't see a clear next step. That gives you a sort of idea about, okay, what format am I going to use to answer this hypothesis, to confirm or deny this? And again, the goal is not to be right when you go and confirm or deny, but it's to help you shape how you're going to answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other really important thing when you're planning and designing is thinking about your sample and who the best people are to answer the questions or to help you figure out if your hypothesis, right, is either validated or not. When you're thinking about who you should talk to, I think you should often look at your organization's core audiences, right, and figure out how your target participants map within that. So I say that to try to explain, for example, if you're higher ed, right? We work with a lot of higher ed clients. Some of the typical UX research audiences that you're going to have are folks like prospects, current students, faculty, and staff. And let's say you're trying to test, right, a website that's marketing tool and recruitment for prospects, right? The ideal, if this is if these are the audiences for your organization, right? Prospects would probably be the best fit, but you could potentially include also some current students, right, to reflect back on some of their experiences. So that would be more of like getting a little bit of attitudinal research with the current students versus maybe actually testing something with prospects. On the other hand, if you are, for example, a B2B tech sales company, your audiences might be highly specific, right? Maybe you're looking for people who are very senior, they're decision makers, they have purchasing power at their companies, and that are IT professionals, right? So we'll understand the the kind of details about the software or hardware that you're selling. And so I think it's really important to be specific about this early on so that as you're planning, and we'll get into this later, but trying to recruit, etc., you're keeping in mind who can answer these questions. I think Celia has a good example for us on this too.
Yeah, so when we were preparing this presentation, I remember in a past life when I was a graphic designer, I was trying to think of examples where we were trying to choose samples or where somebody maybe didn't get it quite right. And my client at the time was someone who was trying to make a dating app. He was trying to design a new dating app and think of the concept for that. And I was doing the graphic design for him. And we were X amount of time through the project. And one day he rings me up and he's like, so I've done some research I've asked my wife and kids what they think of the logo. And so that would be an example where the sample was not correct at all for the research you were doing. So look, as long as you're not doing that, making sure you're in the right ballpark for the people who you're actually trying to reach, that's really what this is about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can all agree that a wife and kids are not the target audience for a dating app, ideally, and they'll be pretty biased if you're the one doing the work. But let's talk too about demographics relevance. I think this is another piece where when folks are trying to think through who their audiences should be, there's always this question of how do we collect or do we rule any people out based on maybe a detail that they're not our target audience, or how do we kind of categorize or segment the data we're collecting? And I think our general take on this is that within the target groups you identified, so kind of like the step we had just talked about, are there any demographics that are relevant to the research? So, of course, for example, if your question is, can users locate the primary call to action on the homepage within 5 seconds? It may not be so relevant to kind of segment that data, right, based on their demographics or to try to target specifically for a demographic. Of course, like we always advise, it's good to have multiple perspectives and different lived experiences to the best of your ability when it's a broad question like that. Um, but I think where it becomes more relevant is the example we have here. Imagine you are a global retailer of women's apparel and you want to know how users navigate product categories right on your site. I think at that point, there are things demographically that do become important, like location, right? Maybe gender identity because you're selling women's apparel. Not to say, of course, that, loved ones, etc., can't be purchasing that, but age, right? Like maybe behavior patterns would differ within age. Are they a new or a returning customer, right? So those are some of the things you want to include. Um, Even when demographics aren't central to your so like that first example they were talking about, it's still good to try to practice. It's still good practice to try to capture basic data. So age range, maybe a device type, right, that they're interacting, especially if it's something like a prototype test or something, or an A/B test. Digital comfort level in general, right? Some of those factors will always still influence behavior. And so it's a good thing to keep in mind. And we also have like a bit of a real world example.
Oh,
Sorry, yeah. When Apple Health first released its when Apple first released its health app, which if you have an iPhone, I think we've had that for a long time, they were gathering a lot of data, but not menstrual cycles, right? And we don't know if they did or didn't do research, but it definitely shows that there was an implicit male perspective that missed a huge portion of the market. And eventually it's a feature they added back in. And then let's talk a bit about how many users, right? Choosing a sample size. So if you're doing qualitative research, this is one of the times when, especially if you have an academic research background, this is one of the largest differences between academic and UX research. In UX research, I don't know if folks are familiar in the room with Jacob Nielsen from Nielsen Norman Group. They are kind of seen as really authoritative in this field. And for qualitative research, they say that 5 to 7 users is the sweet spot, really, for you to focus on. If you have many audience segments, you can consider actually doing 5 to 7 users per audience group, but 5 to 7 generally is that number. And why 5 to 7? So in his research, it kind of showed that after doing usability studies with about 5 participants, you typically are uncovering about 85% of usability issues, which she calls this concept saturation. Now, if you're doing quantitative research, 5 users is not enough and you need a larger sample, right? So, and when I say larger, I'm talking like 20, 30, 40, 500, right? Like sometimes we do research to that scale. And really ideally you want quantitative surveys and tests, et cetera, to have statistical significance, not just observation. But I think I want to be transparent and say realistically, most of the time that we're working on things, we're using the patterns that we see in this data as directional, not necessarily statistically significant, because often we don't have the luxury to worry about that because we're trying to move fast and make changes that will create impact fast. So I think that's a best judgment piece there. And why those large sample sizes? Because quantitative data is focusing on metrics and validation, not feedback. You really want to have representative metrics, which requires you to do this work at scale. And then, of course, the other thing that I wanted to mention here is choosing the right methodology, right? So define your goal early. For example, if you want to understand users' needs or behaviors or align your team or get buy-in, there are different methodologies that are the best thing to do for your goal, right? So we put some examples here and you'll have a chance to get this deck later. So you can kind of explore the details then.
Cool. So now, because we're nerds and we love interactive games with our clients and stuff like that, let's play a little game right now to see if you've been listening. No, not really. So let's say you want to answer this research question. Why aren't users finishing their donation? Which method would you use? So we would answer this question one particular way. That being said, we don't want you to feel scared of getting things wrong because, again, it's UX. There is always nuance. If you had a good reason or rationale for why you chose what you chose, we would love to talk to you about that afterwards. Anyway, so I want everyone to hold up their hands for which method they might choose. If you think usability testing, one. If you think survey, hold up 2 fingers. If you think stakeholder interviews, 3. So everyone hold up your hands. How would you answer? Why aren't users finishing their donation? Good, you've been listening.
I was gonna
That's
say,
what I
what's it looking like out there?
Everyone is holding up 1 finger.
Excellent. That's awesome.
Cool. So that's what we thought too. So that's great. And so, yeah, that would be about observing where users get stuck or confused in that donation flow, unclear steps, friction in form fields, trust concerns. Bonus, other things you might look at as well is the analytics to see, again, behavior in the real world. Sometimes this type of research gets more powerful when you cross-reference other pieces of data. I always think of it, it's like a little bit like being a detective. You're like looking for the evidence. You have your like hypothesis, which you've hopefully generated. And sometimes you've got to look in quite a few places to sort of give yourself more certainty or more knowledge for taking the next step. Yeah. Okay, good.
It's a bit like that, like meme of the cork board and from It's Always Sunny, where he's got all the lines,
100%. That's
ultimately, that's what you're trying to do. Yeah.
every day.
Oh, it's doing Google emojis, so I guess this looks a little bit broken, but that's okay. No worries. The next question you need to ask when you're planning and designing is to moderate or not moderate. That really is the question. Shakespeare got it wrong. But basically, right, you're trying to decide whether you should do a live session guided by a researcher, which could be both over Zoom or in person, or if you're going to do something that is more independent, right? So the pros to doing a moderated session is that you can clarify user behavior on the spot. You are able to probe and kind of adjust your approach based on what you're seeing. And also it's really helpful to observe nonverbal cues, right? So people furrowing their brow, things like that you might be looking for. The cons are that it's time and resource intensive, especially in scheduling. Sometimes I feel like when we're sometimes can feel like the hardest part of research is just like getting people to respond within the time frame you have available. And then the cons, right, are smaller sample sizes. So, that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're trying to do some quantitative research. Unmoderated, right, is when participants are doing tasks on their own. And often how that will happen will be via a platform or a link or something. There's lots of tools like Maze or Optimal Workshop, or even right for SurveyMonkey, things like that, where folks can do those tasks. And the pros is that this approach is really quick and scalable. And it's really great for task-based testing because it keeps things consistent from participant to participant. So you're not, as a moderator, introducing any bias. But the cons, right, are really that you lack the ability to probe or clarify, and that it kind of opens room for some incomplete responses, right, or misunderstandings. If somebody misunderstands one of your directions, you're not there to clarify. And then also those platforms I mentioned, they often may have a cost. So depending on what you're trying to do, that's something to keep in mind. Since this talk is about like DIY and doing it on a budget and maybe with a small team. And then you have to actually like design the study, right? You've made all these decisions about like the what, the how, but really before you have any sessions, you want to draft your introduction text. Typically, that's when you're trying to explain the who, what, why. And then you have to write your questions and tasks. And it's good to have a script for this because you want to be able to be consistent. And I put a little side note on here of when you're writing those questions or tasks, you have to be really intentional, right? So you want to use realistic and goal-based prompts. So you shouldn't ask somebody, can you test the navigation? But you could say, hey, can you find a pair of shoes you'd buy, using this app or website or whatnot? And you want to try as much as possible. And there's a bunch of different types of biases that you can introduce when you're writing a question, and those are good to avoid. But one that I think, for the scope of the session we have today, that is really, really important is to avoid leading language, right? So you don't want to ask somebody, how easy was it to check out? You really want, because that's implying that one, they had success checking out, but two, that, it's kind of putting in their minds that the word easy. And so you really want to ask things that are more open-ended, like, tell me how you felt about the checkout process. And then last but not least, you want to wrap up and gather next steps. So in your script, you also want to write up about, like a little bit about how you're going to thank them for their time, if incentives were used, which we'll talk about in a second, how they expect to hear from you, if they'd like to be part of other research, etc. So let's do another your turn. But for a contextual inquiry, which means somebody is in an actual space, maybe, and watching somebody interact, a researcher is watching somebody interact with the product. Which of the following options are better for a question? Option 1 says, what steps did you take when you were ready to check out? And option 2 says, how easy did you feel it was to find the checkout button on our site?
Okay, I'm watching people. Everyone is, no, there's someone actually holding up number 2.
Okay.
There's, most people are holding up number 1. Here's just how we would answer it. We would go, number 1. There you go.
Yes. And
But again, that being said, what we said earlier is still true. If there's a good rationale for why you're asking what you're asking, then that's totally valid as well.
yeah, and I think, one of the things, so option 2, like, can be a question that you ask, but typically I try to then, if it's a question that's more like that number 2, create a bit more balance. So how easy or difficult was it for you to find, right? So you're trying to create something as much as possible that is neutral. But I'm sure you have a reason, and like we said, there are really no right or wrong answers. So if we had more time, we'd talk to you about it, but we got to keep it moving.
I mean, we've got like, what, it's 12:20 now. We've got about 25 minutes. Robin, I don't know if you want to speak.
No, actually, so I think that to be fair, I think I misunderstood. So when we're talking about context, because I immediately left to I like to do qualitative. That just seems to be where I'm at. And so clearly not listening. I was thinking
No.
no, seriously, we're all good. This is fabulous. But honestly, I'm thinking I'm watching somebody. Well, I'm already watching them. I'm listening to what they're doing and how right. So I'm like, I can see the steps that they took. Yeah. And I wanted to ask about, I would have said,
And
Yes.
that's actually a really good point, because one other thing we didn't touch on, but I'm really going to quickly go over, is
Mhm.
observational qualitative research is great, because you can see the disconnect between if someone's saying to you, yeah, that was really easy, that was like so easy, but then you're watching them struggle, you're seeing them go to the wrong place. So that is absolutely right.
But that's just the bias on it. That's how I usually run it. So I mentally, sorry.
But I mean,
That's
no,
my-
if you get the same answer out, if you get the information out,
Yeah.
then it's valid. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good side discussion. Okay, let's keep
for
going.
sure. Awesome. Perfect. The next phase is to recruit. And like we said, the session is trying to get more folks to do research. So we're going to talk about recruitment methods on a budget. I'll quickly mention before we go to budget friendly, one of the things you can do is that you can use, they're called panel platforms. So a lot of the platforms that you may use for something like tree testing or surveys, etc., or they will come with the ability for you to get users from their pool of kind of like vetted users, right? We didn't include that in this presentation because the cost for that typically can be anywhere from like 45 to like $125 dollars per user. Um, and I think those are great tools. And if you have the budget, that's a great way to do it. But oftentimes, most organizations don't. And so that's why we want to talk about some friendly recruitment methods that are budget friendly. So the first is kind of own channels, and I don't say this in the traditional like marketing definition of own channels, but it's just more the channels that you have the ability to control, like what you post to, right? So calls to action, right? If you have newsletters or social media or anything of that type of sort where you already have an audience base, right? And you want to tap that audience base to get their participation. The pros, low cost, direct access to users, and the cons is just without incentive, sometimes you see lower engagement. Then you have snowball sampling, and really snowball sampling is the idea that you can get one person to ask another, and then it kind of becomes like, maybe it should be called like avalanche. Anyways, that's something for another, right? But the snowball kind of like keeps growing, or at least that's how I always imagine that. But you can ask a participant, right? So maybe you were successful in recruiting like 3 participants, and you can ask them to refer people like them, right? Who fit some of the characteristics you're looking for in your pool. The pros is that this can expand your reach and tap real networks, but it can also be slow and lack user diversity because people are, right, potentially just referring people who are very much like themselves. You can also use intercepting. So that's when you're asking real users on the spot. And I think a cool thing about intercepting is that it could be either in context of a digital like app or site or whatever, or it can also be this is confusing, but on site, like in person, right? So if you think a little bit about like when you're at the mall and there's like those kiosks in the middle. I don't know if anybody goes to a mall anymore. But anyways, then somebody stops you, right? And is like, hey, do you want to? That's kind of the idea of intercepting. Obviously, for this, hopefully it would be less pushy and more respectful. Right, you can put like a little pop-up, or sometimes we have clients who will have at the bottom of pages like, was this page helpful? Thumbs up, thumbs down. But you're trying to get real insights in real time and within the actual context, so it's really fresh on somebody's memory. The cons, and when I say, by the way, on site, one example that I always think about is if you're working, let's say, on improving the catalog app for like application on a desktop or whatever in a library. You might want to be in the library, right? And kind of watching folks interact with it in context. And then maybe after going up to them, right, and saying, hey, I had some questions about this. Or if it's a survey, right, like being like, hey, we have this survey. Do you want to take it? That kind of thing. And that's really kind of unpredictable and sometimes can have low conversion because I would say both pop-ups and kind of people randomly asking you stuff are often perceived as annoying. You can also leverage community partnerships. So, for example, that if you have trusted organizations that already serve your target users via their own channels, you can try to reach out to them. So, for example, we have a climate organization as a client, and they often, their research is targeting folks they do a lot of climate data. So they're trying to target, for example, a lot of builders and architects and engineers. And so if they can reach out, right, to say an engineering association, a professional association, and say, hey, we have this survey, et cetera, we're doing, could you help distribute, right? The pro is that you may get relevant users and leverage this existing trust channel. But this, right, there's a bit of slower setup, skepticism, and you have to coordinate with those organizations. And then really quickly to go through online communities, sometimes especially if it's something that it's unmoderated, folks may be more open to that, but you could post on networks like Reddit, Slack, Discord, or Facebook groups where users already engage. The pros to that is that it can be highly targeted, right? If your Facebook group, for example, is about gardening and you're trying to figure out how to sell better gardening hoses, right? I don't know. Then you're reaching them where they're already engaged. And it's really great for those niche audiences for that reason. But the cons is that there's slow outreach and it kind of requires trust building on both sides. And sometimes, right, subreddits or Facebook groups, whatever, have community restrictions on sourcing. And then the last resort, which is not really recommended because of the example Celia shared earlier about, trying to leverage your partner or children, right, when they're not the target audience, is potentially using your personal network. I think in a bind, right? Like for example, we had a client who they didn't have access to their customers and they didn't feel comfortable, right, proactively reaching out to customers to get their feedback. And so what they decided to do is that they decided to leverage um, their personal network of folks who no longer worked at their company, so weren't really familiar with their site, but that they knew, right, from whatever past jobs, whatnot, that had that fit their target user audience that we needed to speak to. Again, this shouldn't be your first approach. Um, but in a really big pinch, it's better than just guessing altogether. And the pro, right, is this is free and fast. But the biggest con is that the bias, right? If I'm asking my friend, even if I'm not the one running the interview, which that should never be the case, um, but that person, right, may not want to say things that are not working for them or that they don't like about an experience because they don't want to offend their friend or family or whatever. So there's that, and they're not always the target audience. And I think that's why I say this is not, don't start there, because there's a lot of bias you can introduce using that method. And then recruitment messaging. You've given it all the thought. You've decided who you want to recruit, and now you've got to write an email or a social media post or whatnot to try to get people to actually sign up, whether that's sign up over something in person or in Zoom or whatnot. And I think the key things to keep in mind when you're writing this messaging is explaining what is this activity, right? So, for example, we do a lot of tree testing to validate navigation. We can't just say, hey, do this tree test. Why you're doing it, what you're trying to find out. You don't have to be like so specific, like we're trying to find out how people click on this button, but you can just say, right, we're trying to find out how people shop on our website. How much time it will take a user, that's really important, the deadline, and then what's in it for them. And then always, always, always don't forget the link and double check the link before you push send if you're doing something via link. And then to incentivize or not incentivize. The pros are that it boosts participation and it can be done cheaply. So sometimes it can be expensive. But especially if you're doing things like a survey or any task that doesn't take folks a lot of time, you can have a small amount of money, like let's say $25 or $50, and do a prize drawing for a gift card. Or if your organization already has swag or a discount code or things like that, those are some of the incentives that you can use. And the pro really of doing this is that it's supporting fair compensation of the time of the users, right, who are giving you their time to answer your questions, especially if you're doing something that is like a 1 hour interview or things like that, right? That's asking a lot of folks. And so it makes sure that they're compensated for their time. The cons is that sometimes we see folks get motivated for the wrong reasons, right? So especially if you are doing something like a survey, et cetera, that there's not a lot of if you don't put a lot of safeguards in place, right, you may get people just kind of like spam responding and giving less thoughtful responses that are going to skew your results. There's obviously some administrative effort of like trying to coordinate and gather the information correctly when you're setting up um, your research, right, to get their proper email addresses and find a vendor, etc. Um, and last but not least, it must comply with your organization's policies and legal limits. As I mentioned before, we work a lot with higher ed, and a lot of higher ed clients have internal policies that they're not allowed to give anything like any amount of money to their students because it has like tax implications. Um, so definitely check with your organization. And then obviously with your state, I think different states have different limits on how much you can give as an incentive before it becomes taxable, etc.
Cool.
Respond to pizza and swag.
Did you get that? You got it. You got to pick.
Huh?
You got to pick that last one.
Well, yeah, I
Okay,
did.
good. Good. Want to make sure. Cool. So now we've made it to conducting the research. Yes. So unfortunately, I'm going to live with you guys right now. We compressed 3 hours of material into 1 hour. I don't know if you can tell. But for that reason, we're not going to be diving into this section as much today. But again, the other reason for that is not just because of time pressure. Again, I just wanted to underline the fact that the most important thing you can do to make this phase a success is going to be the planning and design. And when you've done, the more work you've done in planning and design, this bit just becomes easy. But the one piece of advice I think I'll give you guys for this part as well, for when you're actually conducting the research, either in a moderated session or an unmoderated method like a survey, make sure you've handled the 3 C's. And what are those? Well, getting consent, making the participant feel comfortable, and asking good questions. Just pretend that question starts with a C for the purpose of this. So getting consent, that's just making sure in a moderated session that's going to look like, hey, here's what we're using the data for. It's going to be shared with XYZ people. It's not going to go outside of the organization. Are you okay if I press record right now? Just like outlining really clearly that in the session. That will make them feel comfortable. The other part of making them feel comfortable, we find, is you got to set up expectations by saying, hey, we're testing the product here, not you. There are no right or wrong answers, so that they can feel more free to speak. As well as you're telling them maybe the research is going to be aggregated. We're not going to share your individual voice. They're not going to know who it comes from. Again, so they can feel more free to speak. And then the number 3, asking good questions, which we gave you a couple of tips on earlier, making sure they're not leading. Yeah, but those are the 3 C's. I won't delve too much more into that right now. We will move on to, this is again one of the most important parts, is turning insights into impact, making sure all of your hard work has actually going to impact a business outcome. I'm going to pass it to Bruna.
Excellent. So in communicating results for impact, right, we often see this is the moment where research often dies, or lives on. And so I think you need to not just do the research, but tell the story of what it means clearly and compellingly. And so there's 2 kind of things that you can think about here. One is this like what, why, who, right? So what did you find? Why does it matter? Who needs to care? and also this OIA framework, which stands for observation, insight, and action, right? So if we're looking at what did you find, which is observation, an example would be users don't notice the CTA. And I think that's where a lot of research fails, right? You're giving your observation, but not the rest of the information. And so you want to move beyond that, right, into your actual insight and say, the CTA blends into the header and the label doesn't match users' mental models, meaning misconversions. And I think that meaning piece is really important because oftentimes the people who need to care about your research in order to make it impactful are folks who maybe are not experts, right? They're C-level executive, et cetera. They're not always within the nitty-gritty of a product, but they do care about business and the bottom line. So I think that's really important is making sure that the why doesn't matter also speaks to whatever audience it is that you're talking to, which kind of leads us into the who needs to care, right? You then want to kind of outline that action of move the CTA lower and label it start application. And again, put that in a language, right, that is going to resonate with the audience that needs to kind of give you the green light to action this research and your findings.
Cool. And so, yeah, one last thing that we'll leave you with here today for turning your insights into impact is the so what test. And so this is something I always need to ask myself after I've eyeballed all that data, I've synthesized. I'm like the guy on It's Always Sunny with the board and the crazy like string. I'm like down a rabbit hole, but it's like to sort of distill things down further and cut out some more of that fluff of what you found so you can effectively communicate to that audience. It's like really asking yourself the question, okay, so what? Why should I care? What should they do about it? And this is key so that your research is actually going to be used. The decision makers can use it. They can use it to make a decision or be clear about what should change in your product and ensure your research doesn't just become a document in a dusty old folder somewhere. So, yeah, that was our talk. Thank you so much for listening. Please reach out.
Thanks,
If you
everyone.
enjoyed this. We're always excited to nerd out and talk all things strategy, UX digital. Again, this was compressed from a 3-hour training. So if that's something that you're interested in, please let us know. Thank you.
And if you connect with us on LinkedIn, feel free to ask us for a copy of the presentation and we can send that to you. Thanks, everybody.
Questions, thoughts, vibes? Everyone's ready for lunch? There's one question.
Yeah. This research and follow the process, we throw it over the fence and you never see it again. So I'm wondering what sort of strategies or tactics do you have to sort of follow up after the research? Maybe your stakeholders have moved that CTA button down further so that you see it or just find out analytics of the results of your research.
Great question. So just repeating for Bruna, the question is, how do we ensure that when we've done all our research, it doesn't sort of go over the fence and something actually happens with it? That's right? Mm-hmm. What sort of follow-up should we do to ensure something happens with it? So I guess I'll say something first off. I think sometimes my impression from my career so far is that sometimes it can be a much longer game than you think. Sometimes you need to, I guess, especially with executives who are really, really busy and they've got everyone clamoring for their attention. It can be just like a process of going, okay, this is going to be a long game, and just like having it in your head that maybe something's not going to happen as soon as you want it to, but that doesn't mean that you should stop telling the story. And I guess, one thing as well as that is to, hopefully, I'm not sure what's happening at your organization, but maybe you've got sort of key KPIs that you can follow. And as much as you can sort of link things to those, I think sometimes that can make the higher ups take a bit more notice. So I guess those would be the two things that have helped me in the past. Bruna, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
No, I think that's a great point. I was just going to say, the other thing is when we talked about earlier of just, trying to I think, Celia, you had the slide very early in the presentation and you were talking about trying to understand what is the risk if we don't do this research or if we don't find this out. And I think that's another way to kind of be able to frame things for impact. If, right, you really need somebody to be actioning on something and you're not seeing that, maybe pulling up analytics to see like, okay, well, now our conversion rate has dropped even lower. Like we're seeing people leave the site after 2 seconds or whatever, right? Like those can also be compelling things to maybe put a little bit of pressure, but it is always a bit political, as Celia said, and it's about trying to build relationships and make your case in a way that resonates with the people who need to agree, essentially.
I hope that.
So I work at a nonprofit where a lot of our audience is people seeking media resources. So it's kind of hard to bring them in for user testing. Use MS Clarity, and I was wondering if you had any insight on how to kind of take the data from there and make it more like real world scenario. I know there's the reporting sessions, but sometimes right we have the rage clips or the heat maps, and because I'm always able to like talk to them using it, what are ways to make inferences from that data that aren't just like my wildest guess, right?
I got
Good
that
question.
one, Celia, so you don't have to
Oh, you
repeat
did?
it. I was able to hear
Nice.
that one, yeah. I would say, with I think I heard you say you're using Microsoft Clarity. Did I get that piece right? Yeah, I
Yes.
think with anything like, so there's a few tools that allow you to do session recordings and heat maps. So Clarity or Hotjar or Crazy Egg. There's more, but some of those. I think the really important piece is to try to focus your attention to specific pages or specific sections or specific actions. And what I say is like those platforms can collect so much data that to realistically comb through everything takes a lot of time. And if you don't have the bandwidth as a team or you're a small team, that's really hard. And so I think being able to track some of those things in specific moments, right? So let's say you said you're a nonprofit, maybe there's a volunteer form on there. Maybe that's really where you want to pay attention to what's being observed. And of course, like it is always best case scenario if you have the time to sit and kind of watch a handful of recordings to see what's happening. But I know that can be really time consuming too. So relying on some of those like rage clicks and things like that it generates for you as a bit of a summary, I think is totally valid as well. But I would say, the main tip I have is really trying to target specific sections rather than look at all of this huge bucket of data everywhere and where it can be really overwhelming. I don't know if that helps.
And I guess the other half of the question, if I got it right, is like, how do you make educated guesses when you don't necessarily have the access to, you're not able to get as close to the user as you might want to?
Is the question kind of asking like you can see the behavior but not the why, I guess?
Yeah, because it's like you can't necessarily reach these people because they're in like difficult situations, or you don't want to do research on someone who's like in a crisis mode, right? Like, yeah,
Totally.
that's a tricky one. I'd have to think about that more.
I was going to say, I feel like the two things that come to mind, and maybe this isn't a perfect answer, but one is, right, if you're watching something like a session recording, you don't have the why. So if you do have the luxury really to talk to users to like round the data out, that's obviously preferred. But in your scenario, especially if it's somebody in a vulnerable situation, that's not always the case. I think one of the things you can do, though obviously this is a bit harder to pull off, is try to talk to um, like kind of an adjacent audience, if that kind of makes sense. This is not the same in terms of sensitivity, but for example, some organizations that we work with in higher ed are really uncomfortable with people doing research with prospects because they worry a lot, right, that may scare them away or make them kind of lose that lead, if you will, or lose an applicant, etc. And what we're able then to do, right, is talk to that adjacent audience of current students, right, who they don't have that fear for. So I don't know in your specific situation, maybe who is a valid adjacent audience, but I think that's something to maybe think about and see if there's anything there of an audience that, right, you wouldn't be like re-traumatizing them or so that it doesn't feel exploitative, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Oh, okay, one more.
The methods was comparison, and I'm wondering if you done how you feel about comparing we've created a completely new design or experience for an existing product. Comparing it to the old design experience.
Yeah, okay, good question. The question is about for Bruna, how do you, in those comparison sort of types of research, when you're comparing like a new version of something to the old version, how do you sort of make that done in a useful way? Is that right? If it's like a really big scale of a change, something like that.
Well, will make it effective and how you about that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, again, in the perfect world, I think we want to design our user research to sort of be able to isolate specific factors that have an impact. So you want to, where you can, you want to sort of make things smaller, more targeted, rather than going, hey, can you use this platform and then this one? What do you think? Because that can be difficult to answer. That can result in sort of too much data sometimes to know what to do with. So I think smaller can sometimes be good advice for those situations. That being said, sometimes there are constraints that you have to deal with, and it just is what it is. You've got to sort of compare one thing with a new one. Actually, there's a project that we're doing right now that there is a similar situation like that. I think in that situation where, let's say you had an old version and you made all the updates and you've got the new version, and now you actually want to assess which one's working better. Something we're doing there is we're testing old users as well as new users to get, like, I guess, a variety of perspectives from that situation to go, how does someone who's never seen any of this before feel about our new version that we think is better versus, and then you can still do that comparative piece with, say, an old user who has seen both versions, and then maybe those sort of two perspectives can help you decide which is objectively better. Yeah. So maybe that's what I would think there. Bruna, I don't know if you had any.
Yeah, I would just add, one of the things that I think is always helpful, though very hard to pull off, is if you're tracking like metrics from one version to another, making sure that before you make that switch, you've set up right analytics, whether that's through tags, etc., to gather that data so you have a baseline to compare to. And then the other thing I would say is depending on if the old version is still something you have access. Like, for example, let's say you're testing via prototype, right? And you have prototype version 1 and version 2. I know it's not exactly what you're saying, but if you still have the old version live somewhere, or not even live, or that lives somewhere, you could try to do an A/B test, right? Where like folks are randomly put into, they see this or they see this, and they kind of interact with it, and then you're able to gauge like which perform better. Of course, again, that's one of those things that's tough because it requires a lot of the strategy ahead of time to figure out, okay, how exactly do we pull this off?
Okay, it is lunchtime right now, so I think I'll let all these folks go. Thank you for listening again. Connect with us if you like.
Thank you, everyone.
Bruna, I'm gonna hang up on you now.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
All right. Bye.